never heard of Poverty Point. Like I said, we're down in Louisiana, the World Heritage Site. Some people say it is the first city in North America. Pretty incredible, actually. If we were to build some of these mounds, I was listening to this person on YouTube. He said we'd need like 17,000 dump trucks full of earth to build some of these mounds. Kind of an amazing sprawling place where they got all this stuff from. Liz, what do we know about this stuff? Or what do we know? What do we know about Poverty Point? Let's put it that way. There's a lot we don't know, so.
Like Poverty Point is that there's no signs of adequate, but yet you have all these mounds and stuff for authors to like the exchange of knowledge, like calculus and mathematics, and farming.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like this is a place that must have been built by farmers. It's a typically, kind of looks like a proto city, but they're definitely not farmers. And they have all these stone objects there and stuff and artifacts, but there's no stone. So they had to get these stuff from somewhere, bring them there. And so there's lots of stuff. There's a ton of artifacts. There's no evidence that they were actually trading with anybody. Like there's not stuff from Poverty Point that ends up somewhere else. So why were people bringing all this stuff there and making these enormous and huge mounds and all these kinds of things? And then it turns out the mounds well, Felicia, what do we find out about these mounds? How are they constructed? Or what's the idea behind them? What were they doing there? The mounds, the structures, how did they do it? It's a controversial theory, especially if we're dealing with hunter-gatherers 5,000 years ago. They were able to, yeah, the things of Poverty Point, the stuff. Oh, yeah.
Okay. I said the location suggests that first, like people may have traded more than just material goods.
Yeah, they traded in knowledge. This author, this archaeologist John E. Clark says that they came up with a system of equilateral triangles and a mathematical system which was used across the Southwest, maybe across the Americas, in order to construct these mounds and artifacts. Again, somewhat controversial because hunter-gatherers are not supposed to have that kind of knowledge and that kind of stuff. So this appears in a book called Signs of Power: The Rise of Cultural Complexity in the Southeast of the United States. Crazy. Can't even get down there. Louisiana is one of my no-go zones, but
It's bigger than the potbelly.
It's a lot bigger than a potbelly hill, it's a huge sprawling area. And they're kind of making a joke here a little bit because we've learned about Göbekli Tepe, and I was talking about how great Göbekli Tepe means, but literally in Turkish, Göbekli Tepe is what potbelly is the name for a potbelly hill. So they're saying it's a lot bigger than that even. It's a huge sprawling area. And their claim is that these would have been in the Southeast, the ones that we know about, and Poverty Point would have been one of these, a little city which at least during certain times of year hosted a rich and influential intellectual life with those equilateral triangles and huge mounds, and would have taken bulldozers full of soil to construct. But like I said, very few people even know about them outside of either archaeological specialists or people who might visit them by chance, although it seems like we won't even chance upon it. Can't even get down to Louisiana, or there's another spot in Florida where you can go and see the Kingdom of Calusa, but really nobody knows about them. Now, they say that one of the reasons that people don't know about these sites is that they're all grouped together under this label as being archaic, as occurring in the time before there was any agriculture. And archaic basically has been used as a way of lumping together a whole time in which people were just supposed to be wandering around and hunting and gathering bands, and nothing really happened. And so they may be perhaps overstating their case to call this an archaeological embarrassment. It's not that the site itself is embarrassing, although maybe our preservation habits could be better on this, but in the sense that it doesn't make sense in the way that these things have been explained to us. Hunter-gatherers before agriculture aren't supposed to be gathering in huge sites and exchanging knowledge and bringing stone objects or making them from 1,000 miles away. Turns out it's not the only place, though. Right decurs. What do we find out about Japan?
And so that was really interesting to think about how all of a sudden that they had to make these changes and discovering these archaeological sites. And of course, luckily they were very meticulous about recording what they found and what they think the elements, but they would piece together some of the past and history.
Yeah, this has resulted in, as you put it, there's been this kind of paradox that there's a modernization of Japan, but then they at least seem to be able to be very meticulous in preserving this stuff. But it's led to a rethinking of this period, which is basically called the Jomon period in Japan, when nothing was supposed to have happened, but all of a sudden they find people making these large structures without having agriculture as well. So this has led to a kind of reinterpretation or revival of certain ideas about the people who were there. I chased an end note in Graeber and Wengrow that says that this Jomon group has actually become sort of popular as the format for inspired the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild video game series. You're shaking your head like you know what I'm talking about. Is that true? Yeah.
Plays a lot of the game and he's pointed out like, oh, these are very simple.
Okay, yeah. Now apparently this is inspiring of one of the more popular Legend of Zelda video games from that society. But again, this is pre-agriculture, when they weren't supposed to be doing anything. Also in a place around Finland and throughout this area, places that are called giants churches or giants tombs, where you have these mounds of stone and other structures. There was a whole YouTube lecture you can look at there where a person was talking about how the people who came later often in various countries just attribute these to a race of giants that must have lived there before they were around. It reminded me, I saw a Troll on Netflix over the weekend. Anybody seen that? Troll. Not the plural troll, the Norwegian film Troll. It was a huge hit, I'm telling you. You'd watch it anyway. It has a very similar idea that there were large giant trolls. Huh? Yeah. So anyway, but the thing is these are actually rooted in archaeological finds across this area. And as they pointed out before, even Stonehenge seems to have been built by non-agricultural peoples who were doing more foraging or more hunting and gathering than they were agriculture. Plus, of course, our favorite, the big idol, or the Shiger idol, which was discovered in a peat boss somewhere in the middle of way up there, the most huge wooden sculpture of the, again, pre-agricultural period. So you can watch this on YouTube and see all the carvings. It's pretty cool. Anyway, what Graeber and Wengrow says is what we now can see is that there seems to be forager monumentality, or hunters and gatherers making all kinds of pretty big art all over the place, and perhaps not always enormous by our own standards, but in terms of being conspicuous on the landscape, in terms of gathering lots of people together, in terms of the labor that would have been required, in terms of the artistic skills that would have been acquired, it seems like they were doing a whole bunch of things they weren't supposed to be doing, at least not in the usual archaeological sense of what hunters and gatherers are supposed to be doing. And so they say that archaeologists, they may be overstating their case a tiny bit here too, have been doing intellectual acrobatics in order to kind of deny that this happened, or to kind of preserve the category of the carefree hunter and gatherer who just goes around in tiny bands. So part of the intellectual acrobatics to sort of ignore these findings or to put them into different categories is you just make up a new term for it. So you say, aha, we have not just the archaic, this must be the new archaic, or the proto-archaic, or the post-archaic. You come up with a new word for it to try and describe what's going on. Or as we've seen, you talk about them as complex hunter-gatherers, but those aren't the same as simple hunter-gatherers. So you make a different category. Or you talk about delayed return hunter. We did that in the last class, the concept of immediate return hunting and gathering versus delayed return hunting and gathering. What they say is basically you're just making up a word in order to preserve your category of the idea that a true hunter-gatherer is egalitarian and in a small band and shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff. And that these people seem to be anomalies on the way to somewhere else. And they also a little bit later tell us about a mode of argumentation that is called the no true Scotsman mode of argumentation. Gabe, you're smiling at this. Is that because you like this mode? I think you should be able to use this mode on people, and you should know what it is so you can use it on people. How do you do it?
Or something, and then someone's like, "Well, I'm a Scotsman, and I put salt on my dough," and then the other person goes, "Well, no true Scotsman salt on my dough."
Yeah, so you first define what no Scotsman, no Hartwick College student would do that, and then, oh well, what just happened there? Aha, no true Hartwick College. So you just rule them out as not a true. I guess it's also called as the ad hoc rescue procedure in logic, which is for those of you who do philosophy and logic, but it's a good thing to be able to use on people, or to be able to spot if somebody uses it on you. You don't want to fall for it. So anyway, they say that part of this is archaeologists kind of still trying to figure out what all this means. But another huge part of this, of the reason why these things have been ignored, has to do with deeper, a a deeper argument about what people were doing during this time, which comes to us from the colonial period, from that time of encounter, especially between Europeans and peoples in the Americas. And one part of that argument probably comes from the fact that indigenous peoples, like we saw, like Candiaronk that we saw, probably overstated their own case against the colonization of the Europeans. They probably said, everything was beautiful here and perfect before you guys showed up. We didn't have to work. Now you're making us work. Everything was nice. Now everything is bad. So part of the argument probably comes from an overstatement, a rhetorical sort of back and forth that people were using to defend their own societies. But the other part of it comes from an old European argument. Cyrus, you said you were shocked by this argument. Shocked. What was it? What is the argument? The agricultural argument. What is it? Yeah, I mean, the argument comes from the idea that hunters and gatherers don't have agriculture. Therefore, they are inefficient. They're not doing what they should be doing. And basically, if they don't have agriculture, it's okay to send them off, displace or do other terrible things to them, because we need to be more efficient with this land. Yeah. And all that. Yeah, it certainly relates to the idea of who should own the land. And the idea was if they're not farming it, then we need to farm it. Or Gabe, what is the essence of this argument here? They're not putting in the work and they're like claims to land use. Their claims to land use are none. Yeah, this actually comes to us from our good buddy John Locke in 1690. Property rights are necessarily derived from labor. So the idea is they're not working the land. They're not improving the land. And so they don't have a right to the land. Now you might think that this is, yeah, I mean, it's actually infuriating, shocking. It's really, it's a pretty awful argument, actually. And so I was actually even more shocked to find that it's been brought up recently. And you may have heard sometimes different people have, and we've begun doing these. Sometimes I've heard us doing them sometimes in museum studies presentations, land acknowledgments. So acknowledging that the land that we are on was once owned by indigenous people to the Americas. And so some people in different colleges and universities encourage professors to put a land acknowledgement on their syllabus. And there's been debate about, is this just a performative gesture? Does it do anything? Is it worth it? But what was interesting to me is this professor over in the University of Washington got in trouble. You don't have to write this down, of course. So basically, this was last year. Now, the University of Washington doesn't say that professors should include land acknowledgements. It just encourages them to, and it gives them some text to put on there, what they call boilerplate. But this professor, who was teaching computer science, put on a land acknowledgement onto his syllabus, a so-called land acknowledgement, which they then got mad at him for, because he didn't have to put it, But he then wrote, I acknowledge that by the labor theory of property, the Coast Salish people can claim historical ownership of almost none of the land currently occupied by the University of Washington. So basically, he's saying, screw you guys. The Coast Salish people deserve to be dispossessed, or they can't claim ownership because they weren't working the land. They don't have the same ownership because that's what we're doing. The labor theory of property, which goes back to John Locke. So like I said, this is, you know, obviously it's an argument that comes to us from colonialism that's infuriating, but it still comes up. It's still happening today. Crazy. The truth is that the indigenous peoples of all the continents had very active management of their land. Through, we've talked about in this class and in cultural ecology, fire reshaped the landscape to make it more profitable for the things that hunters and gatherers would hunt and gather, through different management of the fisheries and the crops. And obviously we've just seen some of the monumentality reshapings of things. A more radical argument, which not everybody agrees with, is offered that that we should consider this a form of agriculture, that we should actually consider this management to be a form of agriculture, just a different kind of large-scale farming of the landscape. So whether you want to push it that far or not, that's not necessarily the point. The point is people were actively doing things. They weren't just sitting there collecting things. They were certainly laboring or working the land. And as Graeber and Wengrow point out, that they often reached measures of profitability or surplus that could support kings or armies. Now, they didn't usually they did not have these kinds of extreme social classes and divisions, but there were places where people who looked like kings and had armies developed. One of those is Calusa in what is now Florida. Another place we probably haven't been to, another great archaeological site. It's a coastal place, a coastal kingdom, which apparently had a huge mound built on coral and seashells, and a king and who had a pretty big army when the Spaniards arrived. So again, this is not necessarily typical of what hunting and gathering populations would do with their surplus, but they could do it. So one of the points that they're making, well, I mean, this is again an argument against, so some people have said, well, that's not typical. That's not typical hunting and gathering, because those were in these coastal areas where they had a lot of fish and a lot of things a lot of potential surplus. And their argument is that during this time, there was no agriculture. And sure, today we've pushed people who want to hunt and gather into the worst landscapes, into the deserts and extreme forested environments and mountains. But 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 years ago, that was what everybody was doing, hunting and gathering. And so they went to the most abundant areas. The problem is, of course, the coastal areas and the places where they had a lot of fish and stuff like that are the first to be occupied by the Europeans when colonialism comes. And so they're the first people to get displaced and destroyed from these areas, and you should try and push them off the land and push them back into a different place. But during this time, we can't say that they were necessarily atypical. They mention here something that we talked about before when we were talking about how the Americas got populated, that it is most likely that it was a route down the coast, that it was people in boats and other craft that were sailing, hugging the coast, and then later migrated inward into the Americas. So I bring this up just to, they're emphasizing here the use of coastal resources as a way of as a way of thriving and creating surpluses, hunters and gatherers. So, what have we learned? What have we learned? What have we learned, Felicia, about all these hunters and gatherers? Are they all the same?
No, they're complex and complicated and diverse than we thought.
Complex, complicated, and diverse. Yeah, the pre-agricultural societies are not all the same. And there's a carnival of political forms, and there's seasonality and all these things. And we've just been learning about forager monumentality and putting up these monuments and having burials and a lot of the stuff that we talked about from the Ice Age, plus the new stuff that we've learned in the Holocene. So you have all this stuff going on. One of the things about these sites, though, that we can be pretty sure about is that sites like Calusa or Poverty Point seem to have some connection to sacredness, to ritual, to these ideas of the intellectual and the sacred geometries, these kinds of things. Yes.
Would you say that potbelly is also a sacrifice?
Gobelki, yeah, probably, yeah. So we don't know what exactly goes on there, but they seem to have been places that were linked to the sacred. And here we go back to Matthew's good friend, James Woodburn, the guy who proposed that the only true egalitarian societies are immediate return hunter-gatherer societies, where you just get your food and you eat it, and that resulted in true equality. However, even in those societies, there was one exception to this egalitarian stuff. Right, Matt?
Yeah, he basically said that that like no one should have hierarchy over another, and that no one could really own land or like keep it all for themselves or put their name on it, and that it should just be everyone's.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's what, again, in a lot of the societies, there aren't these kind of hierarchies. However, there is one place that they do get weird about this. They do get hierarchical, even in those societies where it happens.
Yeah.
I think he said it.
Ritual.
Yeah, so Woodburn says that these societies are remarkably egalitarian, even with gender, the immediate return, but there's one exception, is when they're doing these sacred rituals. Graeber and Wood at Wengrow say that this happens in many places. For example, they give examples of places in Papua New Guinea where there's these whole rituals around phallic trumpets and phallic flutes, and women can't see them, and if they see them, they're going to be in, so they'd be egalitarian in other aspects, but when it comes to these sacred objects, there's these huge amount of ownership that they have. And so they say that actually there's a huge link between private property, the idea that you own something, and the sacred. And this idea comes to us in part from the classic work by Emile Durkheim, The Elementary Forms of a Religious Life, where he talked about the Polynesian concept of taboo. We use perhaps in everyday language these days, but it comes in from Polynesia, the idea that something can't be touched. Ownership means not to be touched. Somebody else can't touch it. And the example they give, of course, is my car. So, if I own my car, what can I do with it? What does that mean that I can own when I own my own car?
free reign, you do whatever you want. Like, you don't have to ask anyone to use it.
I don't have to ask anyone to use it. It's all on me. I gotta do that. And when I'm driving it, I can't just drive it anywhere. I am very regulated about where I have to drive. I can't just park it anywhere either. I also have to be regulated. But there is one thing I can do with my car that you can't. Exactly. I can keep you out of it. That's the thing. Nobody can come in my car if I don't want them to. It's my car. Interestingly, I can treat my car however I want. As we say, my car, my rules. I can throw trash in it, break a window, trash the whole car if I want to. Who cares, right? It's my car. That's my thing. So our concept of ownership, I mean, I can't do, when I'm on the road, I'm actually very regulated. Can't just hit anybody with my car and I get in trouble. Why? Well, you can, but it's against the law, I'm saying. But it's not against the law for me to trash my car. It is against the law to hit somebody in the car too. So, I have the freedom to keep people out of my car. That's pretty free. And I can go sometimes. Anyway, they talk about the idea of people who have gone into Amazonian societies. At first, I used the word Amazon here, but then it sounded like someplace I buy things on. But they say that in many Amazonian societies, many things are owned. So they'll say that this mountain or this animal belongs to a certain individual. But when you own that, it means you have to care for it. It means you have to make sure that it stays well. And this is true of many indigenous societies. When you identify as, they give the example as, the Bear Clan, that means that you own that animal and you have to make sure that it's prospering. You can't hunt it. So the concept of ownership here is one that involves, yes, it's private, but you have to take care of it. Whereas the Roman concept of ownership is sort of like what we have with my car, which is the only way in Roman law, yeah, you're supposed to take care of things or that you can have use rights. But if I really own something, that means I have the right to damage it or destroy it if I want to. That means real ownership. And what they point out here is that instead of the private property being just the realm of the sacred flutes or the sacred knowledge or involving care and obligation, this private property extends out into all kinds of stuff. My house, my car, some people would try to extend it on to like children and, the right to raise your children however I want to, do what I want with them. So it's an interesting form of private, which people might recognize in certain spheres of life, but in our world, we've extended it way into all kinds of other areas. So what they're saying here is that private property, as linked to this idea of something being sacred and sacred rituals, is probably as old as humanity itself. There's not some place in which you could look for the origins of private property because it's been around for a very long time. And at the end of the chapter, they say, the end of chapter 4, the question is not like when private property happened, because obviously people do have these conceptions of private property, but how it eventually came to order so many other aspects of human affairs. How did we get this particular concept of private property, which then extends out over all these other areas? So I thought that might be a good way to summarize what we've learned so far in the dawn of everything, because it's a similar argument to, I think, what they've been making so far in the book. So we begin with our ideas of what life was like before farming, before agriculture, in a natural state or a natural society. And we saw that it basically fell into two versions, one of egalitarian bliss, everybody's happy and equal, which is mostly linked to Rousseau, although others did it as well. And the other one is of everybody fighting each other, the war of all against all, and that's why we need a state to keep everybody in line, the idea of the constant war. So these have been the dominant ideas about what life was like before agriculture and farming. And so with these dominant ideas, a lot of our search in archaeology and history and other disciplines is the idea that we're looking for where this stuff began. What is the origin of inequality? What is the origin of hierarchy? What is the origin of private property? When did it start? And what Graeber and Wengrow are saying, if I read them correctly, is that what we actually find when we look at this archaeological evidence and compare it with the ethnographic record as well, is that people have always had notions of private property. And there's always been ideas about inequality, and there's always been hierarchies, leadership, and those kinds of things. But very important, that there have actually been lots of different ways of doing this, lots of varieties, lots of experiments in social organization, political leadership, different ways to conceive of private property and the sacred, different kinds of doing things. And some of these have people adopt different forms according to the season. So not only are there different ways of doing this, it's one way during the dry season, another way during the wet season, or one way during the summer and another way during the winter. You can oscillate between these social and political and eventually even economic forms. And so the question which they're still posing is not the origins of these things, because these things come about in a whole bunch of different ways, but how did our own societies get stuck in one form of this, in which we have one idea about what belongs to me and what doesn't belong to you, and where we have these pretty hardcore inequalities between various peoples and pretty entrenched hierarchies in which people have to obey their bosses